Hello and welcome! In this video we'll finally be taking a look at a very interesting Kataphron list for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces. It's been some time since we've seen one, so let's first take a look at how this list did. This list came in at 11th place out of 29 players, piloted by a player named Adam Blum in the BolterCon 2022 Invitational Grand Tournament held in the state of Ohio in the United States on November 18th of 2022. And while 11th place out of 29 isn't particularly the best finish, I will say the biggest thing that hurt this list was a single game out of the 5 games that the list played, as it actually did rather well and comparable to the top 8 in the other 4 games, with one game being rather bad, and as such the battle points that it scored did really negatively affect the list in that sense. And as such, if things had gone a little bit better in that one match, this list could have easily placed a few spots higher and would have done significantly better within the standings of the tournament. Anyway, with that being said, let's take a look at what this list is composed of, as it's a rather interesting build and is different than the previous Kataphron defense cohort lists that we've looked at the past on this channel. This army list begins with the Army of Renown, known as the defense cohort, consisting of a single battalion detachment. For the battalion detachment, the forge world that was chosen is the Rise of Forge World, and just to give a quick rundown without going into too many details, as I've done a full video on the different forge worlds, the Rise of Forge World has a dogma that gives 2 specific benefits. The first one being that units with this dogma when they charge and get +1 to their wound roll within melee combat, and in addition to that you add 1 to the charge rolls made by models with this dogma. Though do keep in mind, the defense cohort is a little special in that you're locked out of many of the units you can use, as you cannot use any Skitarii units, so that pretty much leaves you with the tech priests, Kataphrons, electro priests, and Castellan robots in order to build your list. And on top of that, the Kataphrons, Servitors, and Castellans all get an ability called the Extremis Sentinel Protocols, and models with that ability do not benefit from the dogma, but they do get -1 damage to a minimum of 1 damage from enemy attacks if they're wholly within their deployment zone or wholly within an objective marker zone. They also get the benefits of choosing to hold steady or set to defend when being charged by an enemy unit. As such, this means that the dogma is not going to be relevant for the majority of your units and is only really going to come into play on your character and electro priest units. Though with that in mind, the selection of the Forge World is not completely useless, as the Forge World you select still does have some benefit from the dogma to those units, and in addition to that, the Forge Worlds do offer some additional benefits, such as a unique stratagem and a Warlord trait and relic. So as such, even though it doesn't exactly seem like it at first, the Forge World selection does matter a lot more than it might feel like. And with that being said, let's move on to what this list actually includes. This list begins with this HQ detachment, as all battalion detachments do. The first HQ choice for this battalion detachment is a Tech Priest Dominus. This Dominus has been armed with an Eradication Ray and a Macro Stubber for his optional weapons, and he has been given a trait and a relic. The trait that this Dominus has been given is a unique one to the defense cohort, known as Cacophonous Leadership. And Cacophonous Leadership is nice in that it's an aura that says friendly defense cohort units within 6 inches gain the objective secured ability, and models with the Extremis Sentinel keyword gain the benefit as counting as an additional model when counting models for objective secured if you and an enemy both contest an objective. This means that if you position this Dominus in a group of Kataphrons or other units, you'll have a much easier time controlling an objective, and you can potentially even get this aura to a point where it extends to 2 different units if 2 objectives are significantly close enough. In either case, it definitely means you'll have an easier time fighting for objectives, especially in such an elite army where all of your units are pretty much going to cost a good amount of points, regardless of how you build that list, simply because of the limitations placed on you. And as for the relic, the Dominus has been given a Temporocopia, and the Temporocopia allows the Dominus to select an enemy unit within 3 inches, and that enemy unit fights last within the fight phase. This is a rather powerful relic, as it really allows you to gain the initiative when going into melee combat. That being said, it's kind of an interesting combination, as it doesn't seem very intuitive at first, as the trait makes you want to sit on an objective, while the relic wants you to be a little more aggressive when confronting an enemy. That being said though, there is something to keep in mind, and that's you can pretty much sit on an objective with a big unit of Kataphron Breachers, and then if an enemy tries to fight you off of that objective, as there are many very aggressive armies within the meta currently, you can utilize the Temporocopia to allow those Hydraulic Claws to really do some extra work. However, you can also send him into a forward position with either those breachers or a unit of Fulgurite Electro Priests, and essentially contest objectives using him in that way, such that while you're fighting an enemy unit on an objective they've already captured within their deployment zone or somewhere else on the battlefield, you have an easier time of pushing them off and taking over that objective, while other units sit back and hold more secure objectives. And with that being said, that concludes the first HQ choice. Moving to a second HQ choice of this battalion detachment, we come to yet another Tech Priest Dominus. The Tech Priest Dominus in this case has been given a Volkite Blaster, as it does not cost us 5 points like the Eradication Ray, which is probably just a way to soak up the last few points of the army list. He has also been given a Macro Stubber, and he has only been given a trait. The trait in this case is the Carthago Grammatis, which simply allows the player to put 1 unit of Electro Priest within Deep Strike before the game begins. This is something that you kind of have to take with an army like this, because the mobility of the defense cohort is incredibly limited in comparison to some other armies. So you either go with a trait like this to give yourself the ability to better position a unit of Electro Priest somewhere on the board, or you go into something like Lucius, where you have access to the Solar Flare and a stratagem that allows it to deep strike more units than this trait will allow you to do so. In either case, I think it's a fine enough choice, though the fact that the list does include 2 different Domini is kind of interesting, as it does not include any other HQ Tech Priest choices, and as you can see, it didn't include any Holy Orders, which is once again breaking away from the norm. Although the points were rather tight in this army list, however, I think there are places where they could have probably found enough points to grab something like the Logai or some other Holy Order. Anyway, with that being said, let's move on to a troop choice of this battalion detachment. This battalion detachment has chosen to bring the minimal number of troops, being 3 different units. However, these 3 different units are anything but minimal in nature. The first of these troop choices is a unit of 6 Kataphron Breachers, and all of the Breachers have been armed with hydraulic claws, with 5 of the Breachers having a heavy arc rifle, and the 6th Breacher having a torsion cannon. This is kind of an interesting distribution of weapons, as I don't really see what that single torsion cannon is going to do, though it does give you a little bit of heavy firepower. However, I'll also add, in the past, I've seen lists that did bring a single torsion cannon within a unit of Breachers. However, in those cases, the list would break up a unit like this into 2 smaller units of 3, and that way they have a little more consistency and access to those torsion cannons, so they weren't necessarily as homogeneous as a specific unit is. In either case, I think it's an interesting inclusion, and I do think that unit can do a decent amount of work, as it has a solid amount of firepower, and those hydraulic claws can definitely do some serious damage within melee combat. And don't forget with that damage reduction off the Extremist Sentinel protocols, as well as the ability for that Tech Priest Dominus to make an enemy fight last, this can definitely add up very quickly and make your Kataphrons very deadly and very durable. And I'll also say that being able to hold steady or set to defend by choosing the additional point of hit does give you the ability to actually make your Kataphrons much more consistent, and consistency in firepower is definitely something difficult for the Kataphron units and something really holding them back. I wish they had core added as a keyword for being within the defense cohort in specific, but I guess because the defense cohort came out before 9th edition, they did have to make some sacrifices in terms of what they included. Anyway, moving on to the second troop choice for this battalion detachment. The second troop choice is a unit of 6 Kataphron Destroyers, and this unit has a rather standard armor choice, being that all 6 destroyers have been given the Plasma Culverins, and then have been given a 50-50 split of Cognis Flamers and Phosphor Blasters on the remaining models. The split does make sense, as the Cognis Flamer is a little bit expensive, and a lot of times it's not going to come into play, but mostly it's going to be used for firing Overwatch if an enemy unit tries to charge the unit of destroyers, so it does have its utility in that sense, but generally you're going to want to be in a situation where you're not forced to use that Cognis Flamer at all. Anyway, one thing I'll say is also don't forget that the Rise of Stratagem allows you to pay 2 command points to give a unit in your army an extra point of damage on their plasma weapons with no risk, though really that's a very expensive amount of command points to be paying for such a mediocre ability. However, if you're in really desperate need of it, it's at least something to consider. But I really do think they really should have kept the old version of it where it gave +1 strength and +1 damage, and maybe even given it +1 hit just to make it a little more attractive and give Rise a little bit more special identity in terms of their utilization of Kataphron Destroyers. Unfortunately, that isn't the case, but at least it's something, and unfortunately, it's one of the weaker stratagems within the game currently, and really pigeonholes Rise into a melee Forge World as opposed to one that really kind of cares about Kataphron Destroyers if they want to care about them. Moving on to the third and final troop choice for this battalion detachment, we come to yet another unit of Kataphron Destroyers, in this case being 6 Kataphron Destroyers. However, instead of being armed with Plasma Culverins, these guys have been given 6 heavy grav cannons. In addition to that, all the destroyers in this unit have been given Cognis Flamers instead of seeing that 50-50 split. The Cognis Flamer does make a little more sense on the heavy grav cannon allocation because it has a bit of a shorter range, and as such you're more likely to be within a forward position with this unit of Kataphron Destroyers. However, I think you could have probably done a little bit of a split on these as well to save a few of those points and taken off the Eradication Ray on that Dominus, as well as maybe dropped one of the destroyers in one of the units and picked up a couple of Holy Order buffs to those 2 different Dominuses. However, at the same time, the additional firepower of those destroyers and the Cognis Flamers does make sense in various situations as well, So I guess it really does come down to a sense of preference in terms of what the player wants to bring, more so than forcing yourself to play in a specific way that you might not enjoy. In any case, I do think this is kind of interesting, as this list really does utilize Kataphron Destroyers very heavily, and that's something we haven't really seen, as usually they're kind of a secondary option, and lists usually bring more Kataphron Breachers due to their kind of points efficiency. In any case, I still would have probably brought more Kataphron Breachers than Destroyers, but I do like the very heavy firepower that this list allows it to bring, and it can be kind of fun to bring those larger units of Kataphron Destroyers and really put some damage onto your opponent. The lead choice in this battalion detachment is rather simple, consisting of 3 different choices. The first of those 3 choices is a unit of 14 Fulgurite Electro Priests. The Fulgurites were incredibly popular within the 8th edition rules, but have really fallen out of favor, considering that their Siphon Vigor ability has really been nerfed within 9th edition, and as such, they pretty much stopped seeing any kind of play, while the Corpus Carry do see some minimal play. However, in both cases, the Electro Priests simply kind of don't have a unique role within the army in comparison to some of the Skitarii options. However, because this is a defense cohort list, and you can't bring anything like Sicarian Infiltrators or Sicarian Ruststalkers, you are limited to what you can bring, and the Electro Priests do fill a specific role. And don't forget the Carthago Grammatis Warlord trait really does enable it to get some mobility on a unit such as this within the defense cohort, which otherwise lacks a serious amount of mobility. In any case, I do like this unit a little more than what I've seen in past defense cohort lists, and it does make the Rise of Forge World make a little more sense, as you can teleport a unit of Fulgurites onto the battlefield, and then get that additional inch of charge range from the Rise of Dogma, as well as giving yourself a little more consistency when wounding a target that they have charged. In either case, I think it's a nice inclusion, and I do think it gives you a really threatening melee unit that can be a little bit of an annoyance to your opponent, though I do think the Electro Priests need a little bit of something to be more interesting, and I do think it would have been nice if you can teleport more of them, so that still would have kind of made me want to go into Lucius more than I wanted to go into Ryza, but I definitely can see the justification on both ends. Anyway, with that being said, let's take a look at the second and third elite choice for this army list. In this case, because this is a defense cohort list, and we can expect some casts on robots, the second and third elite choice are composed of a single Cybernetica Deusmith each, and neither of these have been given any upgrades, which is a little bit interesting, as you usually see an inclusion of something like the Holy Order of the Logai, which allows them to increase the durability of a unit of casts on robots. In this case, I guess the player didn't see that as necessary, and decided to spend their points elsewhere. I kind of still wish that they were able to get the Holy Order of the Logai, as it's a rather nice ability to give to those casts on robots. In any case, with that being said, we conclude the lead choice and we can move on to the heavy support choice. The heavy support choice is a little bit uniform and a little bit expected with an army list such as this. The 2 heavy support choices both consist of 4 casts on robots armed the same way. All of the robots are armed with a fist and a cast on phosphor blaster for their 2 primary weapons, and then the third weapon is a little more mixed, with 3 of the cast-ons having the Incendian Combustor, while the 4th one in every unit is armed with a heavy phosphorus blaster. I'm not really sure what the logic is of splitting it up this way, but I guess they wanted a little bit more firepower in terms of range options, and they were feeling they were lacking a bit in that regard, or maybe they built 2 cast-ons initially with those heavy phosphor blasters and had to magnetize them, so they just had to kind of make do. Though considering that the fist and phosphor blaster combination on the primary weapons is a bit of a new inclusion, I think that probably wasn't the case, as that was not an option in previous codexes, so they either modified the models after the fact, or they built the models when the new edition was released. In either case, it would be interesting to see the justification for some of the options, such as the lack of inclusion of the Holy Orders, as well as that single heavy phosphor blaster in each of the units of cast-on robots. But in either case, the cast-on robots are a very deadly unit, and they can be all the more powerful accompanied by those Tech Priest Dominuses. I do like this list, and I do like the defense cohort, as it does bring some interesting things to the table, and I really like how this player decided to go with a very heavy firepower army, as opposed to kind of trying to play a more traditional style of Kataphron list. I also like seeing the Fulgurites make kind of a bit of a return, and I do think they might have been a little bit overlooked in certain situations, simply because of how powerful the Ruststalkers have become. Though I do think if this was an army that could include Skitarii, you wouldn't really see those Fulgurites within the army list, and rather you would see something like the Ruststalkers, or the Infiltrators, or just a fast attack choice. In fact, I would say that's kind of a major complaint I have about the defense cohort, is you're so limited in terms of remodel choices that it does kind of sometimes feel a little bit samey, even if you have a decent amount of choice regardless. And I think one thing they really should have thought about is that when you have these 2 different armies, such as the veteran cohort, which is incredibly powerful as you pretty much have access to anything you would want, and then you have the defense cohort where you have a very limited selection to the point that you don't even have a fast attack choice within the defense cohort at all. And in fact, you don't have a flyer choice either, but the flyer slot is a little bit of a new inclusion to the Admech forces, so it's a little more understandable to not have one of those. In any case, I think they probably should have done something like allowing you to take Doom Crawlers within the fast attack choice, or allowing you to take a single unit of something like the Iron Striders to give you that heavy firepower, which you otherwise pretty much lack within an army list such as this. And the reason for that not being simply game balance, but because the Doomcrawler and the Iron Striders kind of fit into the heavy mechanization force when looking at the Castellans and Kataphrons. But in addition to that, if you think about it from a lore perspective, the lore is that they basically scrapped everything in order to make additional Kataphrons and defensive forces. But things like the Iron Striders and the Doomcrawlers are seen as a little bit of a relic, sort of like the Castellan robots and the Skitaris that pilot them are generally permanently installed in those, or they're essentially melted in a vat in order to control the Doomcrawler, while all it really requires for the weapon systems is one additional Skitari member. So while it makes sense things like the Doom Rider, basic Skitari, and the different flyers aren't around because they require a much bigger crew, it doesn't make as much sense when you're talking about things like the Doomcrawler and the Iron Striders, which are a bit more unique in terms of how they're described. However, I do understand, for the sake of simplicity, they probably just split these two things up into two armies based on what was called Mechanicus and what was essentially Skitari. However, I do think they probably should have thought about it a little more, because considering how limited your choices are, it does make the defense cohort feel kind of lacking in a lot of different ways, and maybe they could have even just done something like creating an additional profile and utilizing a double fist Castellan within the fast attack slot just to give it some more variety, but not necessarily changing the types of models you include, simply saying, hey, this is kind of an overdrive frenzy unit, and doing something like that. I understand that's not something they really want to do with these armies of renown, but considering how they did things in this situation, I think they could have probably done more, and I think this is kind of the case with something like the Zangor army for the Thousand Suns, where it just feels like they're trying to force people to play with units that doesn't necessarily work out. And I think with maybe some of the rules being available online, such as the errata and points changes, they could have maybe added to that in that way as well after the 9th edition release by saying something like, oh yeah, the Kataphrons within the defense cohort also gain the core ability, so that way you can at least buff them a little bit better and have a little bit of an easier time running some of those units more efficiently, considering it'd probably be a little more of an advanced Kataphron unit that's within a defense cohort than within a regular Adeptus Mechanicus force. In any case, let me know in the comments down below what you think of this list, and let me know, do you like the Skitari or the defense cohort's forces more, and if you would have changed anything about, let's say, this list or how the defense cohort functions, let me know that as well. And anyway, as always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to help out the channel and the algorithm, and as always, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.